Jasmine Crockett didn't hold back when she confronted Byron Donalds in a congressional hearing, but what she said next left the room in stunned silence.
Welcome to Courageous Voices, where we dive into the moments that spark national conversations. The room fell silent as she spoke the words everyone had been thinking, but no one dared to say. You talk about being proud of your heritage, but you've spent your entire career turning your back on the very people who share it. Byron Donalds stood frozen, his carefully crafted political persona cracking under the weight of authenticity.
This wasn't just another congressional hearing, this was a reckoning that millions would soon witness.
It started as a routine committee meeting on federal programs supporting historically disadvantaged communities. The House Oversight Committee had gathered expert witnesses, reviewed statistics, and prepared what should have been a standard examination of policy. But anyone who'd watched these two representatives clash before knew that when Crockett and Donalds occupied the same space, nothing remained routine for long.
Want to know how this tense moment exploded into a viral debate?
Stay with us on Courageous Voices as we unpack what really happened. The hearing room buzzed with the usual pre-session energy, staffers shuffling papers, journalists checking recorders, representatives engaging in hushed conversations. Jasmine Crockett sat reviewing her notes, occasionally glancing toward the Republican side where Byron Donalds was doing the same. Their history of confrontation hung in the air like a storm cloud.
The committee will come to order, announced the chairman, bringing the room to attention.
The proceeding began with opening statements, witness testimonies, and the customary round of 5-minute questioning periods. For the first hour, everything followed protocol, pointed but civil exchanges about funding priorities, implementation strategies, and outcome measurements.
Then came Donald's turn. The Florida representative leaned into his microphone with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in the spotlight. What we keep missing in these conversations, he began, his voice carrying a hint of frustration, is how dependency undermines progress. During Jim Crow, despite facing terrible oppression, Black communities built businesses, supported each other, created institutions. There was a resilience, a self-sufficiency that we've lost in the era of government programs. The room shifted uncomfortably. Several committee members exchanged glances. Donalds continued, building his case for what he called empowerment over entitlement, citing statistics about program inefficiencies and generational dependency. When his time expired, the chairman moved down the line. The gentlewoman from Texas, Miss Crockett, is recognized for 5 minutes. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone, her expression unreadable. Those familiar with her recognized the calm before the storm. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
She paused, organizing her thoughts. I plan to focus my questions on the data showing how these programs have actually lifted people out of poverty, but I find myself needing to address something more immediate. She turned slightly to face Donalds directly.
Congressman Donalds, I've sat here listening to you romanticize one of the darkest chapters of American history.
Again, this isn't the first time you've suggested that life under Jim Crow somehow built character, fostered community, or created virtues that we've lost. Donalds began to respond, but Crockett continued, I need to understand something. When you speak about Jim Crow this way, are you genuinely unaware of what that system actually did to Black Americans, or is this deliberate historical revision to score political points with a base that's comfortable with that narrative? The directness of the question sent murmurs through the room.
Donald's expression tightened.
That's a gross mischaracterization of my words, Representative Crockett, he replied, his tone measured but defensive. I never praised Jim Crow itself. I talked about the resilience of communities despite those conditions.
Resilience that came from necessity, not choice, Crockett shot back.
People weren't self-sufficient because they preferred it, they had no other option when they were systematically excluded from economic opportunity, housing, education, and basic government services. The committee chairman tapped his gavel lightly, a gentle warning about the escalating tension. Neither representative acknowledged it. This continued framing, Crockett pressed on, that somehow Black Americans were better off when they had to create parallel systems just to survive. It doesn't just misrepresent history, it undermines the very real struggles of those who lived through it. My grandmother didn't tell stories of community pride under segregation, she told stories of fear, of humiliation, of watching friends and family denied opportunities that could have transformed their lives.
Donald's jaw tightened. My family lived through it too, Representative Crockett.
I'm fully aware of the realities, but acknowledging the strength that emerged from those communities isn't romanticizing oppression. That's when it happened, the moment that would be clipped, shared, and analyzed across social media within hours.
Crockett's voice remained calm, but took on a new intensity.
I have to wonder, Congressman, if your perspective on this history and your consistent opposition to programs designed to address the ongoing effects of that history comes from somewhere deeper. I continue to put people into office, and that even means some of our skinfolk who definitely are not our kinfolk, such as yourself, who continue to push narratives that harm the very communities you claim to represent. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Donald's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed.
Are you questioning my blackness, Representative Crockett?
His voice was dangerously quiet. I'm questioning the disconnect between your identity and your politics, she replied without hesitation.
When you consistently advocate positions that hurt black communities while using your identity as cover, what exactly should we call that?
The chairman's gavel came down harder. Members will refrain from personal attacks and stick to the policy matters at hand. But the exchange had ignited something that couldn't be extinguished with procedural warnings.
Donalds leaned forward.
For you to sit there and suggest I'm somehow less authentic because I don't subscribe to your policy prescriptions is exactly what's wrong with this conversation.
You don't own blackness, Representative Crockett. You don't get to decide who's kinfolk based on political alignment.
This isn't about politics, Crockett countered. It's about historical honesty. When you distort the reality of Jim Crow to make a point about government programs, you're not just wrong on policy, you're betraying the truth of what our people endured.
The chairman's gavel came down repeatedly.
Both members' time has expired.
We will take a 5-minute recess.
As the committee members left their seats, cameras continued rolling, capturing the tension that lingered between the two representatives. In the hallway outside, reporters immediately surrounded both, hungry for follow-up comments. Crockett stepped away from the microphones, declining to elaborate. Donalds, however, stopped briefly. What happened in there is exactly what happens whenever someone challenges the established narrative, he told the press cluster.
Character assassination instead of policy debate.
I won't apologize for believing in the resilience and strength of our communities, past or present. By that evening, clips of the exchange had exploded across social media platforms. The confrontation became instantly polarizing, some praising Crockett for calling out what they viewed as Donald's historical revisionism, others condemning her for making the debate personal. On cable news, panels of political analysts dissected every word and facial expression.
This wasn't just about policy disagreement, said one commentator.
This was about the ongoing struggle over who gets to define authentic representation in communities of color. In her office later that day, Jasmine Crockett scrolled through her phone, taking in the tsunami of reactions. Her communications director hovered anxiously nearby.
It's everywhere, she said. Conservative outlets are saying you attacked him personally.
Progressive media is calling it a moment of truth-telling.
Your office line is flooded. Crockett set the phone down. I didn't go in planning to make it personal.
But when he started with that Jim Crow resilience narrative again, she shook her head. Some things can't go unchallenged. The chairman wants to speak with both of you before tomorrow's session, her aide added, trying to get things back on professional footing. Professional doesn't mean letting historical distortions slide, Crockett replied.
But I'll hear him out.
Meanwhile, in his office, Byron Donalds was having a similar conversation with his team. His chief of staff looked concerned as he reviewed the mounting coverage.
This is overshadowing everything else from the hearing, he said.
Your points about program effectiveness, the statistics we prepared, none of that's getting through.
Donalds paced the room. She questioned my identity, Matt. Used my family against me. Made it racial instead of factual. The question is how we respond now.
His communications director interjected.
We've got requests for interviews from every major network.
They all want to know if you stand by your comments about Jim Crow.
Donald stopped pacing. Schedule them.
I'm not backing down from what I actually said, not what she characterized it as. As clips continued to circulate, something unexpected began happening in the comment sections and reply threads.
Beyond the predictable partisan reactions, people started sharing their own family stories, grandparents who had lived through segregation, relatives who had participated in civil rights movements, personal reflections on identity and representation. One viral response came from Dr. Ella Harmon, a 72-year-old history professor who had grown up in segregated Mississippi. When I hear people talk about the resilience of that era, I wonder if they understand what resilience actually cost us. Yes, we built businesses and institutions not because the system worked, but because we had to create alternatives to survive its deliberate cruelty. By morning, the story had evolved from a congressional clash to a national conversation about historical memory, authenticity, and representation. Radio shows fielded calls from listeners eager to weigh in. University lecture halls incorporated the exchange into discussions about contemporary politics and race. The committee chairman, recognizing the heightened attention, called Crockett and Donalds to a private meeting before the day's session resumed. Whatever your personal feelings, he told them, seated in his office away from cameras, this committee has work to do. I need assurances that today's proceedings will focus on the substance of the issues. Both representatives nodded, professionally cordial, but maintaining a palpable distance. I have no intention of making this personal, Crockett said. But I won't let historical inaccuracies go uncorrected. And I won't have my motives or identity questioned, Donalds responded. We can disagree on policy without that. The chairman sighed. Just keep it about the issues, not each other. When the committee reconvened, the room was even more packed than before. Extra journalists squeezed into the press section, everyone anticipating another explosive exchange. Instead, they witnessed something more nuanced. During his questioning period, Donalds carefully reframed his earlier points. To be absolutely clear, he stated, I've never suggested that the Jim Crow era was positive. The systematic oppression of that time was an American tragedy and moral failure. My point, which perhaps I didn't articulate clearly enough, was about how communities responded to that oppression with networks of mutual support that we might learn from today. When Crockett's turn came, she kept her focus largely on the policy data, pointing out statistics that contradicted Donalds' claims about program ineffectiveness, but she didn't entirely let his revised framing stand. I appreciate my colleague's clarification, she said, but we should be careful about extracting selective lessons from historical trauma. The mutual aid societies and black-owned businesses of that era existed because people were excluded from mainstream economic and social systems. The lesson isn't about self-reliance, it's about the human cost of discrimination and the need for systemic change. The rest of the hearing proceeded without personal confrontation, but the tension of their fundamental disagreement remained evident in every careful word and measured response. Outside the committee room, however, the conversation they had sparked continued to grow. History teachers reported students bringing up the exchange in classrooms. Community forums organized discussions about representation and authenticity in politics. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning news program, the host asked Byron Donalds directly about the confrontation. Representative Crockett essentially questioned your authenticity as a black man because of your political positions, the host said. How do you respond to that criticism? Donalds leaned forward, his expression serious. Look, this idea that there's only one acceptable way to be black in America is exactly what's holding us back from real progress. My political beliefs come from my life experiences, my values, and yes, my understanding of history, including the history of my own community. He paused, choosing his words carefully. When Representative Crockett suggests I'm somehow less authentic because I don't align with her policy views, she's doing exactly what she accuses others of, defining blackness in narrow, restrictive terms. That's not progress. That same morning, on a competing network, Jasmine Crockett was fielding similar questions. Congressman Donalds says you made it personal instead of focusing on policy disagreements, the interviewer noted. Do you regret the tone the exchange took? Crockett shook her head. What I regret is that we keep having representatives who use their identity as a shield while advocating policies that harm the very communities they come from. This isn't about personal attacks, it's about accountability. She leaned in slightly. When someone repeatedly mischaracterizes historical trauma to justify cutting programs that help vulnerable people today, that deserves to be called out. And when that person is using their identity to legitimize those positions, that context matters in the conversation. By Monday morning, the clash had evolved beyond the original exchange. Opinion pieces analyzing the confrontation filled major publications. The Crockett-Donalds exchange reveals America's ongoing struggle with history and identity, read one headline. Political authenticity and the policing of racial identity, proclaimed another. Social media platforms were flooded with video edits, memes, and lengthy threads dissecting every aspect of the confrontation. One particularly viral compilation juxtaposed clips of Donald's statements about black communities over the years with historical footage of Jim Crow conditions, titled simply, Revision versus Reality. In barbershops, college campuses, and dinner tables across the country, people weren't just picking sides, they were engaging with the deeper questions the exchange had raised. Who gets to speak for communities? How should we remember difficult history? What constitutes authentic representation? 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, both representatives found themselves booked on the same evening panel at a policy conference in Washington. The moderator, sensing an opportunity for ratings, opened with a direct reference to their viral moment. Representatives Crockett and Donalds, your exchange in committee became national news. Beyond the specific policies you were debating, it touched on questions of identity, representation, and historical memory. I'd like to give you both an opportunity to reflect on that conversation now that some time has passed. The audience tensed, anticipating another explosive confrontation. What they witnessed instead was something more complex. Donald spoke first. I've thought a lot about that exchange, he began, his tone measured. I stand by my policy positions, but I've reflected on how I discuss historical context. When I talk about community resilience during Jim Crow, I need to be clearer about not minimizing the horrors of that system. He turned slightly toward Crockett. I still believe we can acknowledge the strength of those who endured without romanticizing what they endured, but I understand why my framing troubled many people, including my colleague. Crockett nodded, then offered her own reflection. I appreciate that acknowledgement, she said. I've also reflected on that moment. I stand by challenging historical narratives that I believe distort reality, but I could have focused more specifically on the policies and less on questions of authenticity. She paused. That said, I do believe we need to be honest about how personal identity informs political choices. When representatives from marginalized communities advocate positions that harm those communities, that tension deserves examination. What followed was something rare in contemporary political discourse, a substantive, challenging, but remarkably civil exchange about the issues that had sparked their confrontation. They disagreed fundamentally on policy approaches, historical interpretation, and the role of government, but they engaged those disagreements directly without the personal barbs that had made their previous exchange go viral. The audience watched, some almost disappointed by the lack of fireworks, others appreciating the unexpected depth of the conversation. This wouldn't generate the same explosive clips as their confrontation, but it demonstrated something perhaps more valuable, the possibility of difficult dialogue across profound differences. As the panel concluded, the moderator asked one final question. Has this experience changed how either of you approach these conversations going forward? Crockett considered the question. It's reminded me that even when challenging what I see as harmful narratives, I need to focus on the substance of those narratives rather than questioning motives. The stakes are too high for distraction. Donalds nodded. And it's reminded me that how we frame history matters, especially when that history involves trauma that still shapes lives today. We can disagree on solutions while still acknowledging accurate history. They didn't shake hands as they left the stage, the distance between their worldviews remained too vast for such performative reconciliation, but something had shifted. The viral moment had evolved into something more substantive than either had anticipated. Back in their respective offices later that evening, both representatives reflected privately on the experience. In her quiet office, Jasmine Crockett scrolled through messages from constituents who had watched the panel. Many expressed surprise at the civil tone, some disappointment that she hadn't gone after him again, others appreciation for the more substantive exchange. One message in particular caught her attention, from a high school history teacher in her district. My students watched both the committee confrontation and tonight's panel. We've been discussing how to challenge ideas we believe are harmful without shutting down dialogue. Thank you for modeling both passionate advocacy and thoughtful engagement."
Across town, Byron Donalds read similar messages from his own supporters, though with different emphasis. Some praised him for not backing down from his principles, others for showing how conservatives can engage on these issues without conceding ground. One comment from a longtime supporter made him pause. "Appreciated your acknowledgement about historical framing without compromising on policy. That's the kind of nuance we need more of."
Neither representative had changed their fundamental positions, their policy disagreements remained as stark as ever.
The deeper divides in how they viewed history, identity, and representation hadn't been resolved, but something important had happened. A viral moment of confrontation had evolved into a more substantive national conversation.
And perhaps that was the most unexpected outcome of all.
In an era where political clashes were typically reduced to sound bites and used to further entrench partisan divisions, this one had somehow opened spaces for more complex dialogue in committee rooms and classrooms, on social media, and around dinner tables. 2 days later, as Crockett prepared for another committee hearing, her legislative director knocked on her office door. "You'll never believe this," she said, holding up her tablet. "Your exchange with Donalds has sparked curriculum discussions in education departments across the country. Teachers are using it to talk about everything from historical memory to media literacy to civic dialogue." Crockett looked up from her papers.
"The confrontation or the panel discussion?"
"Both, actually. They're using the contrast to discuss how the same fundamental disagreements can be engaged differently." Meanwhile, Donalds was having a conversation with a senior party strategist who had concerns about how the viral exchange might affect his standing with different constituency groups. "The internal polling is interesting," the strategist explained. "Your base loves that you didn't back down on principles, but we're seeing unexpected positive response to your willingness to acknowledge the framing issue without compromising on policy. It's playing as thoughtful strength rather than weakness."
Donalds raised an eyebrow. "So being nuanced about history while staying firm on policy is good politics?"
"In this case, surprisingly, yes. People are tired of representatives who can only communicate in absolutes." A month after the original confrontation, a major university invited both representatives to participate in a formal debate about the historical questions and policy approaches that had sparked their clash. To the surprise of many political observers, they both accepted. The event didn't generate the viral clips that their spontaneous confrontation had, but it attracted significant attention from historians, policy experts, and educators. Students packed the auditorium, many taking notes as the representatives articulated their positions in detail, challenged each other's frameworks, and occasionally found unexpected points of agreement amidst their substantial differences. Toward the end of the debate, a student asked perhaps the most pointed question of the evening.
"Representatives, do you believe it's possible for people with such fundamentally different understandings of history and policy to work together effectively in Congress?" Donalds answered first.
"Working together doesn't require agreement, it requires honest engagement with each other's actual positions, not caricatures, and a willingness to find specific areas where progress is possible despite broader disagreements."
Crockett nodded slightly. "I agree with that, surprisingly enough. The biggest barrier to effective governance isn't disagreement, it's dishonesty. When we misrepresent history, ignore evidence, or refuse to acknowledge the real impacts of policies on communities, that's when collaboration becomes impossible." As they left the stage that evening, something unexpected happened. A group of history students approached them with copies of primary sources from the Jim Crow era, personal letters, newspaper accounts, legal documents, and oral histories they had been studying. "We'd like you both to have these," one student explained. "Not to change your minds, but because these voices from the past deserve to be part of this conversation." Both representatives accepted the materials with genuine appreciation, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not an attempt to score points for either side, but a reminder that beyond the political frameworks they brought to these discussions, there were real historical experiences that deserved honest engagement. Later that night, as Jasmine Crockett sat in her hotel room reviewing the student-provided materials, she came across a letter written in 1953 by a black business owner in Alabama. He described the constant humiliations and obstacles of operating under Jim Crow, but also the deep community connections forged through collective resistance.
The complexity of his account, the pride alongside the pain, the resilience alongside the rage, couldn't be neatly categorized into either her framework or Donald's. Across town, Byron Donalds was having a similar experience, reading through oral histories of families who had fled the South during the Great Migration, their accounts of both the oppression they left behind and the new challenges they faced, including government policies that both helped and harmed their communities, resisted simplistic narratives of either self-reliance or state support being sufficient alone. The next morning, as both prepared to return to Washington, they coincidentally ended up in the same airport terminal. There was a moment of awkward recognition, followed by a brief but civil acknowledgement.
"That was an interesting event," Donalds offered.
"It was," Crockett agreed.
"Those students came prepared."
A slight smile crossed Donald's face. "Some of those primary sources, they're more complicated than either of us tend to frame them." "History usually is," she replied.
"Policy should reflect that complexity." They didn't become friends, they didn't suddenly find political agreement.
In committee meetings and floor votes that followed, they remained firmly opposed on most substantive issues, but something had changed in how they engaged those disagreements, a recognition, perhaps, that beneath the partisan frameworks lay human experiences that deserved honest reckoning. 6 months later, when a national news program did a follow-up story on the confrontation that changed the conversation, they interviewed educators, historians, and ordinary citizens about the impact of that viral exchange and what followed. Amma, a high school civics teacher, summed it up perhaps most insightfully. "What made this different from typical political clashes was that it didn't end with the viral moment, it evolved into something more substantive. My students still disagree about who was right, but they've learned something valuable about how to engage difficult history and identity questions without reducing them to simple partisan narratives." The final shot of the segment showed brief clips of both representatives continuing their work in Congress, disagreeing as strongly as ever on policy, but engaging those disagreements with a complexity that their viral moment had unexpectedly helped model for the country. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all, that in an era of sound bites and instant outrage, sometimes the most important conversations begin with confrontation, but don't end there, they evolve, deepen, and occasionally open spaces for the kind of honest engagement democracy requires, but rarely rewards. If this story moved you, if you believe in the importance of confronting difficult truths while maintaining the possibility of dialogue, make sure to subscribe to Courageous Voices. We're exploring the complexities they don't want discussed, and we're just getting started.